Hello, welcome to Enchantment of Eternity. So, 9 years ago, I started my channel Enchantment of Eternity 10 years ago, and 9 years ago, I uploaded my review for the movie Interstellar, which at that time had just come out a few months prior. I had a lot to say about the movie, however, many of you probably haven't seen it because YouTube took it down and banned, well, didn't take it down, but it banned it in every country pretty much in the world except for United States and Canada. So if you live outside those two countries, you weren't able to watch this video. So in celebration of my 10th anniversary, I decided to finally re-release this video. So taking out all copyrighted content and re-uploading it again, which is something I've been too lazy to do throughout the years, but finally doing it now. And so what follows is 9 years old, but it was my original review for the film Interstellar, which is still one of my favorite movies of all time. Enjoy. Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Interstellar. Now the first thing you may be asking yourself is why I'm making this review so long after it was released in theaters. Well, I made a decision a while back to wait until it was released on DVD before I did the review for it, because I wanted to give it a full spoilers review of it, and if I waited for DVD would be give people more time to see it, and I also wanted to see it for a second time before reviewing it. So, it was just released on DVD where I live, and I just saw it for a second time last night. So, as I just touched on, this review will have spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, you should probably wait until you have before you watch this review. Now, I did touch on Interstellar in my top 10 movies of 2014 videos, in particular my extended version of that video, but I thought this deserved a video all of its own. Although I did talk about it at some length in that video because it was my number one favorite movie of 2014. Also, this review is about the reaction it received on the internet and by critics as much as it is going to be about the movie itself, because I wasn't quite pleased with the reaction it received. Now, full disclosure, Christopher Nolan is one of my all-time favorite directors. Has three of the movies he did are in my top 20 favorite movies of all time: Memento, The Prestige, and Inception. I absolutely love those movies. However, does this mean I think Christopher Nolan can do no wrong? No, absolutely it doesn't. I personally felt Insomnia was not at all a very good film. In fact, I think it would be fair to say I'd consider it a very bad movie. One that was not plotted out very well and wasn't very well constructed. In fact, after I saw that movie, I thought maybe Memento was a fluke and this wasn't a good director after all. But then he did The Prestige and later Inception, so I ultimately changed my mind. And this is where I'm about to say something that many people consider huge blasphemy. I didn't like the Dark Knight trilogy, and in particular, I found that the second and most popular film in the trilogy, The Dark Knight, to be the worst in the trilogy, as I found it was nothing but a pretentious piece of garbage. Hate me all you like, but that's what I felt about the film. I will get more into that later when I do my top 10 most overrated movies of all time, but for now, the relevance comes in because clearly I don't think Christopher Nolan is infallible, and despite the fact he is one of my favorite directors, I think he can most definitely do wrong, obviously. So when I first heard Christopher Nolan was directing a science fiction film called Interstellar, I was intrigued and definitely wanted to see it, but I hadn't already decided it would be great. I wasn't sure if it would be great because, as I had just established above, I don't think Christopher Nolan is incapable of making a bad movie. But I did at least want to give it a shot. So the reviews started pouring in on YouTube, on certain channels that I love, that I frequent a lot, and they weren't that good. I would say mixed at best. There were a few people who loved the film, but the majority of the critics didn't like it. Some thought it had potential but squandered it, while others thought it was just bad all around. And then I had a couple of friends post about it on Facebook. One of them said it was awesome, absolutely amazing, and the other said it was the worst piece of crap that they ever had to sit through, and that for the love of God, do not see this movie. And to be honest, neither of those friends have an opinion in films I tend to agree with. So to be honest, I didn't know what to expect. But when I went to see the film, the possibility that it would suck was strong in my mind, but I also thought it was equally as likely that it would be great. So overall, I went in with an open mind. It had only been a week since it was released. Well, at least here. I think it may have been released earlier in the US. And already it seemed like everyone had already seen it, and there were spoilers being thrown around everywhere. I managed to duck them, but I really wanted to see this movie as soon as possible because I was curious to see where I would fall with it. So when I finally saw it, I was completely blown away by it. I was transfixed in a way I had never been before, and once the movie ended, I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. I was just so overwhelmed with how amazing it was watching this film, and it was what I would describe as an experience. But don't misunderstand me. It's not one of my all-time favorite films. It doesn't make my top 20, which means it's not even my favorite Christopher Nolan film, because I think Memento, The Prestige, and Inception are better because it does have flaws. I can kind of see where some of the complainers are coming from. But I personally was blown away by the strength of this film, that for me, they far outweighed the flaws enough where I would say this was by far my favorite film of 2014. So first of all, let me name some of these flaws and what they were. Where I agree with the people who didn't like the film. First off, where I agree most with the critics is that Cooper's son Tom was really underplayed towards the end of the film. The end of the film focused so much on Cooper's love for his daughter Murph that it did kind of make it seem like he didn't care about his son all that much. So that much I can see. Secondly, the beginning of the film, before they left Earth, was slightly longer than it needed to be. Like, the whole thing with the drone was kind of pointless. But I was kind of expecting that because I came in knowing that the film was going to be about the relationship he had with his daughter, and since she wasn't coming with him, I knew that they had to be explored before he left Earth. And lastly, how the ending could have been better. To be clear, I disagree with those who say that the ending was horrible and ruined the whole film. However, I do agree it could have been better. Not that I felt the fact, that he was Murph's ghost all along was dumb, or the fact that love is what was driving them was cheesy. No, I actually really liked those things. What bothered me was I felt they were too on the nose with what was going on, that it would have been better had they made the ending a bit more ambiguous, had they not spelled it out so clearly with dialogue that he was her ghost, or that love was the driving factor, or that the they that they thought were aliens were really highly evolved versions of humans from the future. But the funny thing about that is, even though they did clearly spell that out, there was a surprising number of people who didn't catch that and still thought that the people who created the wormhole were aliens. But anyway, I thought the whole ending would have been better had it been more ambiguous and open to interpretation, and I didn't hate the scene where he saw his daughter as an old woman. I thought it was very touching, had the right amount of sci-fi weirdness to it, but I did feel maybe it would have been better had Cooper just died. But it's no big thing. But what I really didn't get is why Cooper had to steal a ship to go after Brand on the planet. Maybe someone can explain this one to me in the comments. I mean, I watched it again specifically trying to catch it, but it still made no sense to me, because I thought plan A was for them to find a viable planet for the humans to move to, but Michael Caine needed to solve the problem of gravity in order to get a large amount of humans off of Earth and into space. So it seemed like Plan A worked once Murph solved the equation. So if that's the case, why are they just sitting in the space station next to Saturn? Why aren't they actually going through the wormhole? I thought the whole reason was because they didn't know which planet to go to. So first of all, they have all these ships. Why are they just sitting there? Why don't people use them to find the right planet? And secondly, now that Cooper's back, he'd be able to tell them which planet to go to. Why not just say, here's the planet that we need to get to, so let's get this hunk of junk moving. Instead, he steals the ship and goes off on his own. I don't get that. However, I did notice the second time I watched it that the scientist that Brian went to see, her lover, was dead. And it looked like that there might have even been some sort of crash or something. But in any event, she got there 80 some years later because of that maneuver they did with the black hole. So he probably would have been dead by then anyway, unless, of course, he hyper slept, but apparently he didn't do that. As for what I loved about this film, this is one of the most intense films I've ever seen. There are a few times I was sucked into this film. I was so invested in what was going on. I compare it to Quentin Tarantino in so much as the style of slow suspense. What I mean by that, it really drags out the suspense of what's going on, leaving you totally on edge for a long period of time. Tarantino does this with subtle dialogue, and this film did it with slow-moving space sequences. Either way, it was really effective, and part of the reason it was so effective was how well developed these characters were, how invested they made you in their well-being. Yes, the two other scientists that were with Brandon Cooper were two-dimensional characters just there to be killed off, and that part did annoy me a bit. But putting that aside, all the time we spent on Earth wasn't a waste. They were made well-crafted, well-executed scenes that really got you to care about the people who were left behind, and you really felt for the people that went into space. The scene where they were on the water planet and then they realized what they thought were mountains in the background were actually waves was just such an amazing scene and so intense. When I was first watching it, I was just completely blown away. I remember a stray thought crossed my mind. I couldn't understand how anyone could not like this film. I mean, I might have been so impressed because I'm really into sci-fi. Maybe someone who isn't has much into sci-fi reacted a bit differently to the scene, but it was so unlike anything I've ever seen before. And then it only got more intense in the scene where Dr. Mann tried to kill Cooper and then tried to steal their ship and ultimately just ended up killing himself in the airlock while damaging the ship. And then you really thought they would be stranded, but Cooper was determined to dock with the ship, and and it was spiraling uncontrollably towards the planet. Man, that was just so intense, so much more so than most other suspense scenes in other films, because as I said, this film earned it by really getting you involved in caring for the characters, by raising the stakes so high. After all, it wasn't just those characters on the line. If they failed, it meant the end of humanity. So I don't know about you, but I was clutching like the arms of my seat for these scenes. It was just so intense. And this film really had heart as well. The opening scenes got you really invested in Cooper's relationship with Murph, and seeing how upset she was when he left was heartbreaking. But what was even more powerful than that was when Cooper returned from the planet with the time dilation. 23 years had passed and he was watching 23 years worth of messages from his children, who in the span of a couple hours for him were now as old as he was or older. That was such an amazing, heart-wrenching scene and one of the most powerful in any film. Also powerful was the ending where Cooper was in the Tesseract and watching his young daughter and trying to stop stop himself from leaving, was screaming at her to make him stay. Again, really powerful stuff. And for my money, this was the best performance I've ever seen out of Matthew McConaughey. I know he won Best Actor at the Oscars the previous year for a different movie. I've still yet to see that movie. And I know he wasn't nominated for this film, but I think that had more to do with politics since so many critics hated this film. But for my money, I think this was by far the most powerful performance he's ever given. And speaking of the ending, as I already mentioned, I do feel it had a few flaws. It could have been tighter and more succinct. I did really like it, though. I didn't think it was an amazing or mind-blowing ending, but I did think it was really good in tying the whole film together, and really heart-wrenching as well. And of course, I have to mention the music. As I said before, music is very important to me in film, much more so than most other people, and good music can go a long way to making me appreciate a film even more. And the music in this film was simply amazing and enhanced the scenes so much, made them so much more intense or that much more emotional. Even a lot of people who didn't like the film acknowledges this. However, I do agree with the complaint that the sound design was a bit off, and at times the music or sound effects were too loud and you couldn't hear the dialogue. It was ironic that one of the few Oscar nominees it got was for sound design, which was one of the few I think it didn't deserve. It deserved Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actress, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Screenplay, Best Score, which it did get a nomination for, and Best Visual Effects, which it did win the Oscar for, but not Best Sound Design. Oh well. So, a lot of people, particularly those who didn't like this film, would often bring up that Interstellar was inspired by 2001: A Space Odyssey. Christopher Nolan outright says this, and it is evident in the film that this is the case, and so many people who didn't care for this film will say it's just a ripoff of 2001, or it just tries to be like 2001 and fails. And this reminds me of an interview I heard once with my favorite musician, Billy Corgan from the Smashing Pumpkins. The interviewer asked him who his biggest musical inspirations were and what musicians inspired him to make the music he did. And Billy Corgan refused to answer the question. And the interviewer then asked if it was a marketing strategy to not answer the question, to which Corgan replied by blowing up at him and going on a tirade. What he basically said was he refused to answer who his inspirations are because then critics would simply use that to say you might as well not listen to his music, instead just listen to insert inspirations here. Or that he's just trying but failing to be like said inspirations. So I think that most certainly holds true in this case. Critics are just arrogantly using the inspirations of this film to beat it over the head with, and I personally don't think this argument holds any water at all. Yes, you can undeniably see influences from 2001 in style, but in substance, the two films are actually extremely different, which is why I loved Interstellar and I did not care for 2001, because it had to do with the types of films I prefer and enjoy to watch, and these were obviously two very different types. Where 2001 dealt mostly in subtle metaphor and extremely slow-paced, stylized storytelling, that may appeal to some, but not to me. Interstellar is about a human relationship between developed characters that is dependent on this abstract concept of love that this film attempts to make tangible. And that sort of thing really appeals to me, but it may not appeal to others. And it may sound like a really controversial thing to say, that I thought Interstellar was better than 2001, until you realize I didn't much at all care for 2001. So there are hundreds of movies I think are better than 2001. I acknowledge it was a well-made film from a technical standpoint, and many consider it groundbreaking, and it was influential to many filmmakers, but it's not my thing personally. I just don't care for it, which is why I don't mind that Interstellar was inspired by it, because there were certain stylistic choices it can certainly draw inspiration from that I agree were great, but in terms of substance it speaks more to my personal taste and what I look for in a film. To be honest, it actually reminded me a lot more of 2010, the year we made contact. That, in my opinion, is an underappreciated sequel to 2001, which I actually preferred to the original, which is another blasphemous statement to make, but that's how I feel, because like Interstellar, 2010 actually had a tangible plot, fully developed characters, and new science to explore its stories. So I feel, as a fan of 2010, that's why I was attracted more to Interstellar. And watching Interstellar reminded me of the magic I felt when watching that film. Another reason I liked this film more than 2001 was because in 2001 the machine was the villain, and I found this to be a really cliched and uninteresting story device in general. You know, to have like killer robots, that's always a turnoff for me. I think it's much more powerful to critique the inner struggles and flaws of mankind, and that's what Interstellar did. Some might think it was a bit obvious because they had the man who would become an antagonist be named Dr. Man, which many felt was too on the nose that man was the main adversary. But to be honest, I didn't really notice that, and I personally don't really care either way about it. I think the way it was executed was amazing. Many were distracted by the fact that he was played by Matt Damon and that he kind of just popped out in the movie unexpected, but I wasn't off-put by this at all. I thought Damon did an amazing job in the film and was one of the best performances. Dr. Man was not at all your typical two-dimensional villain. He was really a well-rounded character who was clearly just afraid and who had gone a little insane with being left alone on a planet to die. So I completely believed this character. I completely loved this performance and felt that the character added to the richness of what the film was going for, and that the real obstacle humanity needed to overcome was themselves and their own fears. And speaking of robots, I loved how the robots in this film didn't turn out to be bad guys. Not only that, but they were also very interesting, well-developed characters that added a sense of levity and humor to the film, and overall it did enrich the story and make it that much more awesome. So let me get more into the reaction by critics and audiences on the internet. The best way to describe the reaction to this film was polarized. You had a sizable group of people who absolutely loved this film and thought it was the greatest thing they've ever seen, or at least seen all year. And then you had a sizable group of people who absolutely hated the film and thought it was the worst movie they've seen in years. And most people thought that the movie was pretty good but flawed. I know every well-known movie has its followers and detractors, but this seemed much more polarized than most films. In that regard, it reminded me of another one of my favorite films, Cloud Atlas, which was also had a very polarizing effect on audiences. A lot of people loved it, a lot of people hated it. In fact, I feel that Cloud Atlas was similar in tone to Interstellar in so much it had an element that tried to conceptualize what love meant and capitalized on emotion. To me, these films have, an element that the TV show Lost also had, which is why I loved all of these productions, where as it seemed that the newer generations of films seemed to try to eliminate all traces of melodrama and focus on sterile, emotionless atmosphere. And to be honest, I don't really care for that style, but that's just my personal preference. Melodrama is not a dirty word, and if done correctly and not to excess, I think it can be a very powerful thing. And I don't know about you, but I like films that make me feel something, particularly films that shows that stimulate my heart and my mind simultaneously, like Lost, Cloud Atlas, and Interstellar. I read one comment about Interstellar where the person just wrote, "I didn't care for Interstellar because I'm not into that new age love feel." And that's perfectly fine, and I'd like this comment and would congratulate them for hitting for hitting it on the head. I didn't like this movie because I personally don't care for the style. That's honest criticism. I have no problem with that, and I wish more people could say things like that. However, there were a lot of criticism I did have a problem with. The majority of the critics I saw were identifying what they believed to be plot holes or bad writing, but through their articulation, it was obvious that they simply didn't understand what the film was actually doing or what it was going for, which was blatantly obvious to anyone who did get the film, which is why these particular critics' videos were flooded with comments saying that they didn't understand the film. It got to the point where many of these critics had to say, yes, I did get the film. But really, it was obvious that they didn't. They just really didn't. They never stopped to think that there was a reason why so many people were telling them they didn't get the film, and instead just put it off on the fanboy excuse, which I'll get more into later. There was a YouTube movie review channel, in particular, one that I used to watch frequently that has a panel discussion of certified critics reviewing movies that was completely and totally botched it. They were getting so many things wrong, and by that I don't mean they had opinions I disagreed with. If they personally didn't like the movie, that's fine. Everyone's entitled to their opinions, but it was completely crystal clear that they didn't get this movie at all. It was the worst movie review that I've seen in my life. This from a channel that I previously enjoyed, but this one video made them look like arrogant, pretentious hipster idiots that knew absolutely nothing about what they were talking about. One of the things they said was to criticize the method of time travel that was used. That being that basically you can do nothing to change the past. The past is already written. This is the same method found in films and shows like 12 Monkeys, Time Crimes, and Lost. So this hipster douchebag said that the method of time travel is thoroughly discredited by science and referred to as pseudoscience, and anyone with any lick of intelligence wouldn't use it. So I recently watched a video from Neil deGrasse Tyson where he supported their use of time travel and explained how it was totally scientifically plausible. The way he explained it was time is like the fourth dimension, whereas space is in 3 dimensions. You can walk left or right or jump up or down, but time, you're constantly trapped in the present. You can't move back and forth through the past or the future. But he said theoretically, if there was a space that exceeded 3 dimensions, you can look at time as another dimension just like space, and you would be able to move back and forth through it, then everything would always be the way that it was. You'd always be drinking a cup of coffee, you'd always be being born, you'd always be dying, so you'd be able to check in on any of these time periods, but you wouldn't be able to change any of it because it had already happened. It reminded me of the wormhole aliens from Star Trek Deep Space Nine that existed outside of linear time. At any rate, you should check out these videos where Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about the science of Interstellar. He explains it a lot better than I could. At any rate, I don't want to get too much into the science of the film because I know many people like to argue about it. Many people who hated the film say the science sucked. Those who loved the film would often say that those who hated it just didn't understand the science. And that's not what I'm saying at all. I personally don't care whether or not the science was accurate. After all, I'm a huge fan of Star Trek, which throws many scientific facts to the wind. But just as a matter of fact-checking, one of the producers and the writers of this film is a well-known physicist, and so they tried to take a route in this film that was true to scientific reality. But when they ran into situations that were not, known or couldn't, that modern day science hadn't expanded to yet, it became highly speculative, but they didn't outright get anything wrong. As I said, there's a series of videos by Neil deGrasse Tyson where he explains the science behind it. This isn't to say all scientists agree with him, and because he vouches for Interstellar is 100% accurate. A lot of scientists may in fact find flaws with the science provided in this film, but all I'm saying is it's definitely not just all made up and they didn't know how science works at all. They obviously knew what they were talking about. it is in fact based on actual science, even if some of it is highly speculative, and thus highly contested scientific theories. Those with no science degrees claiming they know more than Neil deGrasse Tyson can frankly fuck off. But, as I said, I'm not getting too hung up on the science of it when I say these critics didn't get the film. I'm not referring to the science behind it, but more of the plot and the feel of the film of what they were going for. But there was a lot of bickering and arguing going on back and forth on the internet between both people who loved the film and those who hated it. And there was common arguments from both of these sides that pissed me off. Some of those who loved the film would say that those who hated it were too stupid to understand it. I think that's a really closed-minded thing to say. I hope you didn't think I was saying that when I mentioned many who criticized it didn't get it, because I wasn't saying that at all. Everyone has their different opinions and stories that they're attracted to, so there could be any number of reasons why someone didn't like this film. To assume that it's because someone didn't like the film means that they're stupid is asinine. All I was saying was sometimes people mention things about this film that demonstrates they didn't get the film. That doesn't mean that they're stupid. It just means those particular opinions are uninformed. And the common statement made by those who hated the film, which I alluded to earlier, was those who loved Interstellar are just Nolan fanboys. This one particularly pisses me off because it's very dismissive, arrogant, and ignorant. Apparently it has root in the fact that there was a huge online group attacking all of those who criticized The Dark Knight Rises, and even going as far as making death threats against those who didn't like it. Now, I can't speak much for that because I didn't really follow any of that because, as I said, I wasn't a huge fan of the Dark Knight trilogy. But basically, this assumption of calling anyone who thought Interstellar was a fantastic movie a fanboy is, failing to acknowledge that others did really enjoy this film for legitimate reasons, and that others have personal preferences or opinions that differ from their own. It's an entirely short-sighted and self-centered point of view. I had a good friend who hadn't seen the movie yet tell me he suspected people just like Interstellar because it was directed by Christopher Nolan. So I calmly explained my personal experience that I mentioned earlier in this video on how I feel Christopher Nolan certainly can do wrong, and that I had not predetermined that the movie would be great just because he directed it. It was the movie itself that led me to believe it was great. In fact, there were some who liked the film that say people just hate this film because it was Christopher Nolan. I personally think the whole Nolan thing is a red herring. It's a misdirect on either side. I think the majority of people who loved or hated the film did so on their own merits, not based on who directed it. People should just stop trying to presume they know why someone else didn't share their opinion. It's very demeaning, such as to say, "Oh, you only like or hate this film because Christopher Nolan directed it." That's just asinine either way. And I personally don't understand why this assumption is only made about Christopher Nolan movies. I personally don't like films by Martin Scorsese, Ridley Scott, or Wes Anderson, not because they're bad filmmakers, but because I personally just don't care for the style their films tend to make. Yet I don't see anyone name-calling Scorsese, Scott, or Anderson fanboys. I never said to anyone who liked The Departed, or Gladiator, or The Royal Tenenbaums, "Oh, you only like that film because such and such directed it." That would be a dumbass thing to say then, just like it is now. However, if you want to see an online review from someone who totally got this film, you should check out Chris Stuckman's spoiler review of Interstellar. I mean, man, he nailed it. I didn't agree with everything he said, but so much of it I totally agreed with. I think it was so spot on. He also named some things in the film he saw as flaws, and he didn't give it a perfect score. He gave it a B+, and apparently some people were complaining that he only gave it a B+, not higher. And I'm just like, just leave the dude alone. I personally don't care if he gave the film an F, because it was obvious from his review that he totally understood it, and that was good enough for me. He didn't drastically misrepresent the film like so many other critics did, and plus he put this film in his top 10 movies of 2014. Few critics did that. I read one comment where they took the Rotten Tomatoes ratings of all the movies in his top 10, and Interstellar was the only one below 90%. It was at like 77%, and said, what movie doesn't belong here? Then another commenter responded by posting a link to IMDb's top 10 movies of 2014, in which Interstellar was number 1. His response was to say that IMDb can't be trusted because it's voted by the fans and therefore can be corrupted by fanboys. And what I have to say about that is Rotten Tomatoes can't be trusted either because it's run by critics, and most of which are arrogant hipster douchebags that think they're better than everyone else. I think there's a reason why movies like Lady in the Water and Birdman had tirades against critics, because sometimes they can come off as arrogant, out of touch with general audiences. I myself think critics can be useful. For example, I wish that I had went to Rotten Tomatoes first before I rented After Earth. I would have seen it was had a score of 11%, and I wouldn't have wasted my time with that giant piece of crap. So critics can be useful. They certainly have their purpose, but they're not an end-all be-all to everything. I'm not going to pretend this film wasn't awesome just because some jagoff says otherwise. I know critics are trained, having majored in media studies and films at the university myself. I've been through some of that training, so I know along the lines of how they think. It doesn't mean, that they're infallible or always right. They're just informed, and there's informed opinions and uninformed opinions, but at the end of the day, it's all just opinion. After I first saw Interstellar, I avoided talking about it to the people who hated it because, they have every right to hate it. I knew I wouldn't change their minds, but more than that, I considered watching this film a beautiful experience, something that really affected me, and I didn't need someone shitting all over that experience and telling me the only reason I liked the film was because of who directed it, which is part of the reason why I waited so long to make this review. At any rate, my rating for Interstellar is a 10, the best. As I said, not my all-time favorite movie, but it definitely deserves the highest rating. In fact, I saw this movie after I started making my top 50 movies video series, but I made a comment in the first video that this would rank at number 27. So there's only 26 other movies I would consider better than this one. It's not perfect, but it's grand. So that's it for my review of Interstellar. You should check out my channel for other movie reviews, and if you're a Game of Thrones fan, I have tons of videos out on that, so you should check that out. Make sure you subscribe to keep up with future videos I'll be doing, and thanks a lot for watching.